80s casuals were well-dressed, working-class kids who took all these really expensive upmarket sportswear brands that were produced for the rich and the affluent of Europe, and basically they wore them on the terraces and estates all over Britain. The main brands were Adidas, Lacoste, Cerruti, Tacchini, Fila, Elise, Pringle, Diadora, Patrick Cagoul's, Headbags, Kappa, Navica, Berghaus, Armani, Lois, Lyland Scott, Pierre Cardin, Australian, Puma, Benetton rugby tops. First brand I ever remember craving was Adidas. I got my first Adidas t-shirt on my 8th birthday. I had 3 older brothers who were all well dressed and sort of kind of rude boys. They all became football casuals, and we grew up in West Heath, which is in Birmingham, right on the edge of the Hawksley estate. One of my earliest memories of seeing the clothes on TV would have been in the tennis, in particular Wimbledon. Borg and McEnroe, 80, 81, were always playing against each other, huge rivals. Obviously Fred Perry in the old days. Borg always wore Fila, and Fila tracksuits were, some of the most iconic ones in casual culture at the time. He had a pair of Diadora trainers called Borg Elites, which were huge amongst the casuals, especially if you had them in gold. They were made of kangaroo leather. McEnroe always wore Tacchini and what we called night Wimbledons, which I believe were actually called night tennis. Everyone loved McEnroe because he was so crazy and angry. He always wore Tacchini. And he would go, he would have arguments and he would smash his racket and do stuff that people loved him. There were other players as well, like Jimmy Connors, who was a brilliant player and also had great clothes. He was sponsored by Cerruti, but it was a bit sort of less known, that label, and it was only kids who had a bit of money would wear it. You'd have Lendl, slightly later, a couple of years later, wearing Adidas, and Henri Lacan, who used to wear Lacoste, and everyone would get really excited if any of those were playing, because you'd see a new tracksuit top. I think it's important to point out, in the 50s and the 60s, sportswear would have literally been just for doing sporting, and it wasn't perhaps until the mid to late 70s where people started wearing it casually, and then it sort of became fashionable. People started wearing it on the terraces. It would have been, I remember seeing kids wearing sportswear like rude boys and skinheads wearing Slazenger jumpers, Fred Perry's Slazenger V-necks with the buttons done up on your Fred Perry underneath. A huge percentage of the kids who were football casuals were probably rude boys before. They got a sense of looking smart. They got a sense of wearing Slazenger and Fred Perry, and then they were like, "What's next?" That's kind of what happened. I think that trainer culture also started around this period of time in the UK. It would have been like rude boys wearing things like Doc Martens and brogues, but also there was a specific trainer of choice at the time would have been Adidas Kick, partly because they were the cheapest, black leather with white stripes, really simple. There were also Adidas Mamba and Bamba, which were slightly more expensive versions of these. And then the kids who had a little bit of money, like the older kids, had Adidas Samba, which were full leather and really expensive at the time, and they were made for, specifically, I believe, for playing five-a-side footballing. To be honest, there were lots of other great trainers from other brands, but nobody really could come close to Adidas. You had Forest Hills, Keglers, Trim Trab, Grand Prix, Wimbledons, SL80s, Rom, Gazelles, Adidas Jeans, the Stasi, the whole ZX range, 500s and 600s, which were huge, Munchen, Barcelona, the whole City range, and then weirdly Adidas leisure shoes, which were we just call them Adidas shoes, which looked kind of like something that you'd get from Clark's that a geography teacher would wear. Interestingly, Nike wasn't a huge brand in terms of football casuals. There were certain pairs of trainers like Nike Internationalists that were sought after, and everybody liked those. But I don't really remember anybody wearing Nike clothing as such. There was one pair of trainers called Nike Omega Flames. And there was a kid at our school called Ginge who was legendary because he had a pair. He was the only kid I can ever remember wearing Omega Flames. He was also the only kid I can ever remember wearing a full tracksuit, because often casuals are shown in like films, etc., as wearing full tracksuit, but I can never remember that happening apart from this one kid, Ginge. An interesting aspect of casual culture, sort of slightly later, was that the kids stopped wearing tracksuits, Fila Tequila, and started wearing Aquascutum and Burberry, Pringle jumpers, and the stuff of the sort of the kind of clothes that the upper classes would wear. And it was slightly ironic that kids off estates would spend half a paycheck trying to dress exactly like a member of the royal family. The two Ronnies used to do a thing on a Sunday night, and he would just talk, sit in a chair and talk and do comedy sketch, but he wore Pringle and Leyland Scott, and everyone would tune in just to see his jumper. And even later than that were brands like CP Company and Timberland and Stone Island, but that was less, I think, about the clothes and more associated with football violence and kind of yob culture. I mean, obviously the casuals were associated with football violence and in a big way, but it wasn't always just about football violence. The thing to point out is that a lot of the kids, if not all of the kids who were wearing these clothes at the time, were from really poor backgrounds. They were off the estates. There was huge unemployment at the time, so there wasn't a lot of money about. And obtaining these clothes was quite difficult. The clothes were very, very expensive. And for a lot of kids, they were hard to get hold of. It was hard for them to buy the clothes. People were so obsessed with having an item of clothing that had a brand on it or a proper label that was one of the big ones. We had a kid at school called Gorman who actually bought some Lacoste sweatbands and got his mum to cut the badges off the little crocodiles, and she sewed them onto his school jumper. Something that you really can't ignore when you're talking about casual culture in the early 80s is its direct link to football violence. There was loads of violence on the TV at the time. Stuff was happening all over the country, not just the football. There was the miners' strikes, there was the London riots, there was the Birmingham riots. All this stuff was caused really by Thatcher, and she'd established like the YTS scheme. There was huge unemployment everywhere, and there was just a generation of really angry young working class men who needed somewhere, I guess, to expel their anger and to get it out of their systems. And it appears that a lot of them did it at the football. As a young man on the terraces watching and not necessarily getting involved in it, with the violence kicking off all around you, it was both terrifying but also really, really exciting. The football stadiums at the time were all terraced rather than seated. There were no cameras. The policing was pretty second rate and really, really poor. The terraces were essentially like fenced in school playgrounds. You had thousands of angry blokes, and it was at the time pretty much all blokes in one place. It's a perfect breeding ground for violence and for the fights to kick off. Yeah, police horses running into the crowd, people throwing missiles. Because there were no cameras at the time recording people, that came in much later. Like instead of 2 or 3 people just having a fight on the terraces, you were talking about hundreds of blokes kicking off. All of the clubs would put coaches on for the fans to go off to different cities to go and watch their teams. Going to football on a Saturday for a lot of people at the time, and still is a massive part of their life, and that's pretty much you'd work all week and you'd just be looking forward to that and getting a coach to go to another ground and go and watch your team. And at that particular period, you'd want to look as sharp as you possibly could. The slightly ironic thing is that they're probably going to end up in a scrap or a row, and their nice new threads that they spent all their money on would end up getting trashed and ruined. It's also that thing about they were sort of alienated. People felt alienated and brushed aside. But actually, when they were a member of a gang, of a crew, or like part of a football fan with a load of other people who had a similar interest, you kind of felt like you belonged because you felt like you were somebody. A really exciting thing about being on the terraces at the time was looking at what other kids were wearing and checking out like if there was anything new or any new trends, any new trainers, any new tops that you'd not seen before. And there was always at the back of the terraces what you called the top boys, which were just like the main guys from the crew, like the Zulus, and loads of really funny, notorious characters. I suppose it was no surprise that they were always the best dressed and had the best clothes. And as you can imagine, most of those clothes were not bought legally. It was well documented that fans who were travelling away to European games, which were mostly in France and Italy, they started to bring back all these brands. It's not like now where you can just get what you want by the click of a button. Brands like Tacchini being Italian, and Fila, which is also Italian, and Lacoste, which was French. You could only really get those clothes if you were in those countries. Of course, like British teams at the time were being successful in Europe, in particular Liverpool were a really, really good team. And winning and getting further on in tournaments, so they were travelling across all to the various countries, seeing the clothes and then trying to find ways to bring them back home, either by buying them or by other means, often illegal. All this tied into the already poor reputation of English fans travelling away in Europe. It was Spain and Italy really where you could get the clothes, because Spain and Italy they had Lacoste everywhere. It was weird because it was almost like they all had it and we didn't have it. So when we were going over there, it was like, what's all this? We want some of this. My very first Lacoste in royal blue. My brother bought it back from Spain in 82, 83. I was so excited. I think people look back on it as being solely about violence and the terraces, but like all subcultures, particularly working class youth cultures, such as like Teddy Boys, the Muds, Rude Boys, and even indie kids, it's very much about fashion, about identity, about being part of a gang. And at a time when, Britain was just so broken, it was about being proud of where you're from.